1987, a demolition crew, tearing down an abandoned farmhouse in rural Kentucky, found something that made the foreman call the police immediately. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards was a collection of family photographs, spanning over 2 centuries. But these weren't ordinary family portraits. In photograph after photograph, generation after generation, the faces stared back with the same haunting emptiness, eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it, expressions so void of emotion they barely seemed human. The local sheriff who first examined these photographs would later tell his wife he couldn't sleep for weeks. What the demolition crew had stumbled upon was evidence of one of America's most disturbing family secrets, a bloodline that had been quietly destroying itself for over 200 years, through a practice so taboo, so devastating, that an entire community had conspired to bury it forever. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story begins in 1794, when Ezekiel Holloway arrived in the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, with his wife Sarah and their 5 children. Like many settlers of that era, Ezekiel was seeking isolation, land where his family could live according to their own rules. Far from the judgment of civilized society, what he couldn't have known was that this desire for isolation would become a curse that would haunt his bloodline for the next 11 generations. The Holloway family established their homestead in a valley so remote that the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. Through treacherous mountain terrain, Ezekiel, a deeply religious man with radical interpretations of biblical law, believed that God had chosen his family for a special purpose, that he preached to his children that their blood was pure, sacred, and must never be diluted by mixing with outsiders. This wasn't merely religious fervor, it was the beginning of a systematic program of genetic isolation that would have catastrophic consequences. By 1820, as his children reached marriageable age, Ezekiel faced a problem that would define the next 2 centuries of his family's existence. The nearest communities were days away by horseback, and Ezekiel refused to allow his children to marry outside their bloodline. His solution was as simple as it was devastating. His children would marry each other. First cousins became husband and wife. Uncles married nieces. The family tree began to fold in on itself like a closing fist. The first generation of these unions seemed relatively normal. The children born from these marriages showed no obvious signs of distress. They were perhaps a bit more withdrawn than typical children, more prone to staying close to home, but nothing that raised immediate alarm. Ezekiel took this as divine confirmation that God approved of his methods. He had no understanding of genetics, no knowledge of recessive traits, no comprehension that he was conducting a biological experiment that would grow more horrifying. With each passing generation, the family's isolation deepened. They developed their own dialect, their own customs, their own twisted interpretation of normality. By 1840, the second generation was ready to marry, and the pattern continued. Cousin married cousin, brother married sister. The gene pool grew smaller and smaller, concentrating traits that nature had spent millennia learning to hide. By the 1860s, the 3rd generation of Holloways was coming of age, and the first disturbing signs began to manifest. Children were being born with subtle but unmistakable abnormalities. Their facial features seemed flattened, compressed as if someone had pressed their faces against glass. While they were still forming in the womb, their eyes, once bright and expressive like their great-grandparents', began to take on a vacant, distant quality. More troubling still was their behavior. These children rarely cried as babies, showed little interest in play, and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of emotional numbness. The local doctor who made rare visits to the Holloway homestead noted in his private journals that the children displayed what he called a peculiar absence of natural affection. They didn't seek comfort when hurt, didn't laugh at amusing stories, didn't cry when separated from their parents. It was as if the capacity for normal, human emotion was slowly being bred out of them, generation by generation. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the family adapted to these changes. Rather than recognizing the horror of what they were creating, the Holloways began to view these traits as virtues. They praised their children's calmness and spiritual tranquility. They interpreted the vacant stares as evidence of deep contemplation, the emotional numbness as proof of divine detachment from worldly concerns. The family had begun to gaslight itself on a generational scale. The Civil War came and went, but the Holloways,